There is a road in western Wisconsin in the northern part of Polk County that runs 8 miles between a town called Clayton and a milk processing complex that rises off the horizon like a small city of its own. The complex belongs to Vanderweld Dairy. It has 2,000 cows in 3 barns. It runs 3 milking shifts. Its tanker trucks come and go around the clock, silver and white painted with a black cursive V on the side that the drivers, when they are alone in the cab and honest about it, sometimes call the mark of the beast. On a Thursday morning in the second week of October in the year 2005, one of those tankers turned off that road, drove up a gravel lane past a broken whiteboard fence, and stopped beside a barn that had not held a milking cow in almost 2 years. The barn belonged to a 24-year-old woman named Merritt Halverson. She was standing beside a 1,500-gallon stainless steel stock tank when the tanker pulled in. She was 5'4". She was slim the way farm working women are slim, which is to say lean without being fragile, with the kind of forearms that come from lifting 50-pound feed sacks since the age of 8. She had light skin the color of new cream with a warm undertone, a scatter of pale freckles across the bridge of her nose, and large light blue-gray eyes that watched a truck park longer than most people were comfortable with. Her medium brown hair had warm chestnut and sun-lightened undertones. It was parted near the middle and pulled back into a loose, practical low ponytail, with several thin strands falling free around her forehead and temples, and she had a faint smudge of grain dust on her left cheek that she had stopped noticing sometime around 6 in the morning. She wore a red and cream plaid flannel shirt that had belonged to her father. It was 2 sizes too big and had been washed to softness. Over the flannel, she wore a caramel brown canvas farm jacket, also her father's, with a darker brown lining that showed at the cuffs where the hem had worn back. Her jeans were faded medium blue dusty around the thighs from the morning's work in the equipment shed. Her boots were her own. They were the only new thing on her. She held a clipboard in her left hand. She held a small stainless steel sample dipper in her right. When the tanker driver climbed down from the cab, she raised her chin about half an inch, which was her way of saying good morning. The driver was a big man of about 30, sandy-haired in a Vanderweld uniform shirt with a name patch that said Tory. His full name was Torvald Ranyard. He had driven that route for 4 years. He had been told that morning by his dispatcher that the pickup at the end of it was a new arrangement. He had asked no questions. He said, "Miss Halverson." "Mr. Ranyard, you want the load in that tank there?" "Yes." He looked at the tank. He looked at her. He was working out whether to say the thing he had been wanting to say since he saw the address on his manifest, which was, "Ma'am, you sure?" But he did not say it. Tory Ranyard had a wife who made her living reading the room at the diner in town, and some of that had rubbed off on him. He said, "How much are you taking today?" She looked at her clipboard. She said, "All of it." He unhitched the outflow hose. He walked it to the top of her stock tank. He locked the coupling. He climbed back up to the tanker's belly valve. He turned the wheel. The valve opened, and thousands of gallons of rejected milk came down out of the tanker's belly like water from a broken dam, hammering into the stainless steel tank, climbing up the inside wall, cresting the rim in less than a minute, and spilling in a heavy white sheet down the outside of the tank and into the mud around Merritt Halverson's boots. She did not step back. She stood inside the spray. She caught a splash of it on her jacket sleeve. She lowered the small sample dipper into the flow at the rim of the tank, drew a clean pint of it, held it up to the pale October light so she could see the color and the fat separation, dipped a strip of antibiotic residue test paper into it. Watched the strip change, wrote a number on her clipboard, and marked the manifest with the tanker's identification code. At the end of her driveway, a second tanker was waiting. She raised 2 fingers toward the road. "Hold." Tory Ranyard, up on the catwalk above the belly valve of the first tanker, saw the signal, saw the way she said it without turning around, saw the way she said it in a language that did not require her to raise her voice. He watched her for about 3 seconds. Then he shifted his weight quietly so she would not see it, and he thought a thing he did not say to his dispatcher when he got back to the yard that afternoon. "I thought that girl is not what my dispatcher thinks she is." The story of how Merritt Halverson came to be standing in that spray on a Thursday in the second week of October in the year 2005, at the age of 24, on 80 acres of Wisconsin ground, with a mortgage the bank meant to collect in 6 months, begins 1 year earlier at a kitchen table in Clayton on a Sunday afternoon in the last week of March of 2004, when her father, Eric Halverson, died, sitting up in his chair with a cup of black coffee going cold in his hand. Howe was 51 years old. The doctors called it a stroke. The men at the co-op in Clayton called it what men his age had been calling it for 100 years, which was, he wore out. Eric Halverson had wore out. He had wore out in 1998, 6 years earlier, when a corporation named Vanderwell Dairy had bought the milk buying contract on his section road, and then over the course of 13 months had methodically dropped the price it paid for 100 weight of his milk until the number no longer covered the cost of producing it. And Eric Halverson, who had run a small tie-stall dairy of 42 Holsteins on those same 80 acres since he was a young man of 26, had walked into First Farmers Bank of Clayton in the spring of '99 and refinanced the last of what he had left in the ground, and he had never stood quite the same way after. He had lasted 6 more years. He had done other work. He had leased his pastures to a hayman over in Armory. He had done odd carpentry. He had raised his only child, a daughter, in a house that his own grandfather had built in 1921 with green shutters and a screened porch that faced the road. And he had kept all those years in the top drawer of a roll-top desk in the front room a small leather-bound notebook. Merritt found the notebook 2 days after the funeral. She was 23 years old that spring. She was at that time working 2 counties over as an assistant herd manager at a mid-sized dairy called Yelmquist Brothers, which ran 370 cows and had hired her out of the 2-year dairy science program in Menomonee the summer she turned 20. She had lived in a small rented room over a laundromat in a town called Balsam Lake. She had come home to Clayton every weekend for 6 years. She had spent every one of those weekends since she was 14 in the barn, with her father learning things that could not be taught in a classroom, about the way a cow moves before she goes down with milk fever, and about the way calving records tell you what you should have known 6 weeks earlier, and about the way a small dairyman who has been beaten by a large one can still, if he keeps his notebook, understand exactly what happened to him. The notebook was bound in dark brown leather. The corners were worn, the spine was cracked, there was a cotton bookmark ribbon sewn into the binding that had faded from red to something almost gray. She had known the notebook existed since she was 6 years old. She had seen her father write in it 1,000 times. She had never opened it. She opened it for the first time on a Wednesday evening in the first week of April of 2004, sitting at the same kitchen table where he had died 5 days earlier. She turned to the first entry. It was dated April 11, 1978. He had been 25 years old when he made it. It was a list in his careful, blocky hand of the 12 cows he had just bought from an auction in Osceola. Under each cow, he had noted the age, the milk history, if the seller had provided one, the price, and one small observation in his own words. Number 4 had been described as walks like her feet hurt her. Number 7 had been described as quiet eye will give more than she looks. Merritt sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she read the first page. She turned pages slow. She read through the 80s. She read the calving records. She read the price her father had gotten for 100 weight in 1983, and again in 1988, and again in 1993. She read the year the roof of the North Milking Parlor was replaced. She read the year her mother Sigrid had left. She read the year when Merritt was 7 that her father had bought the tie stall extension on a note that had taken him 14 years to pay off. She read into the 90s. She read about the drought of '88. She read about the price collapse of '86. She read about the way Vanderwell Dairy in 1997 had come into Polk County and started buying up the smaller milk collection routes. She read her father's careful dated entries about the meetings he attended, about the way the new Vanderweld field agent had smiled at him and said the words, "We're just standardizing the pricing structure in that particular flat voice. That means we are lowering it." She read about his refusal to sell his ground. She read about the offer of $85,000 for 80 acres in the fall of '97 and about how her father had said no. She read about the price for 100 weight of milk on the same section road going down quarter by quarter over the next 13 months until her father's records showed him running at a loss he could not close. And she reached on a page dated November 14, 1998, 6 months after the day he had sat at his own kitchen table with the last of the sale papers on his 42 cows in front of him, an entry that was not a herd record. It was 5 sentences long. They throw it out, you catch it, That's the whole trick. Been thinking on it all week. Rejected milk gets hauled at their cost. They pay to dispose. What if a small hand said, no, I'll take it and raise calves on it? Not their calves, the ones they sell off cheap because they don't fit the profile. 2 years to a bred heifer. They'd have to buy them back. She read the entry twice. She read it a third time. She did not cry. She had, in the previous 5 days, cried more than she had cried in the 23 years before. She had cried at the funeral. She had cried the night after alone in her room over the laundromat in Balsam Lake, sitting on the edge of a mattress that did not belong to her, with the phone in her hand and her mother's number on the screen, and a call she could not bring herself to make. She had cried hardest of all on the Sunday morning she had stood in her father's empty milking parlor and put her hand on the stall where cow number 12 had stood in the last week of 1998 before the buyer's trailer had come up the drive. She was empty of crying now. What she felt sitting at the kitchen table in the first week of April was not grief. What she felt was the specific stillness of a person who has just found a door in a wall they had thought was solid. She turned the page. There was no more writing. The next page was blank, and the page after that, and the page after that. Her father, in November of 1998, had written the paragraph, closed the notebook, and never opened it again. But it had been written down. That was the thing. He had known. In November of 98, 6 months after he had sold his herd to a corporation that had spent 13 months bleeding him white, her father had sat at this kitchen table and had written down in 5 sentences the exact shape of the countermove that could have been made. And he had never made it. He had run out of money. He had run out of energy. He had run out of the specific kind of will that a man in his mid-40s who has just been beaten by a corporation loses and does not, in most cases, ever get back. He had died with the notebook still in the drawer. She had inherited 80 acres of ground and a house and a note at First Farmers Bank in the amount of $47,000 and a paragraph in a notebook. She had also inherited the anger. She did not know that yet in the first week of April of 2004. She would come to know it. She left the notebook on the kitchen table. She stood up. She walked out to the barn in the last light. She stood in the empty stalls for a long time looking at the concrete floor where her father had knelt to milk in the days before the automatic pipeline had gone in the summer of 1980. She looked at the marks in the concrete. She looked at the initials her father had scratched into a support post with a pocket knife in the summer he had built the extension when he was 31 and she was 7. She said out loud to no one, "All right, Papa." She went back to the house. She called Yumquist Brothers the next morning. She gave her notice. She told them she would work the next 8 weeks straight through into the last week of May, and then she was going home. The next 18 months are not the main part of the story, but they are the part a man over 60 needs to know if he is going to understand what happened in a stainless steel stock tank on the second Thursday of October in the year 2005. In the last week of May of 2004, Merritt Halverson finished her final shift at Yumquist Brothers, packed the back of a 1998 Chevy S10, the color of a mourning dove, drove 40 miles home to Clayton and moved back into the house she had grown up in. She did not move into her old bedroom. She moved into her father's bedroom. She did this because there were more windows in that room, and because the light was better for reading in the mornings, and because she needed, for a set of reasons she did not entirely understand and did not entirely need to be in the room where he had slept for 51 years. She stripped the bed. She washed the sheets. She threw out 3/4 of what was in the closet. She kept his caramel canvas jacket and his red and cream flannel shirt and a wool cap she had never seen him wear, and a folded handkerchief that had belonged to his grandfather. She had in her account at the credit union $7,200. She had at First Farmers Bank of Clayton a note for $47,000 secured against the deed of the 80 acres. The note had been taken out by Eric Halverson in the spring of 2002. He had used it to pay off a smaller balloon on the original 1998 refinance, and to replace the metal roof on the barn, and to bore a new well after the old one had gone brackish, and to bury his mother, whom Merritt had barely known, in the fall of '03. The 2002 note was itself a 5-year balloon. It came due on April 15th of 2007. That was the number that lived in Merritt Halverson's kitchen for the next 36 months. April 15, '07. It hung in the air the way the smell of coffee hangs in a house on a cold morning. It hung in the air whether or not she was actively thinking about it. It hung in the air the way a promise made to a dead man hangs in a house he built himself. She had, in the summer of '04, exactly 2,739 days that she had lived in this house. She counted them. She had from May of 2004 to April 15 of 2007, 1,047 days ahead of her. She spent the first 6 months of them driving to Vanderweld. She did not walk into Dale Brunner's office with a proposal. Not yet. Not for 6 months. What she did for those 6 months was drive the 8 miles to the Vanderweld complex 2 or 3 times a week at different hours of the day and sit at a picnic table in the small paved yard behind the visitor entrance where the truck drivers ate their lunches and she watched. She had a notebook of her own. It was blue. She had bought it at the drugstore in Clayton in the second week of June of '04. In it, she wrote the following. She wrote the number of tanker departures per shift. She wrote the number of tanker returns. She wrote which returns went into the main receiving bay and which returns pulled around back to the smaller building. She came over 3 months to identify as the disposal processing station. She wrote the license capacity of the disposal bay. She wrote the state-mandated fee structure per gallon of Class II milk product that a dairy of Vanderweld size was required to document as disposed. She got that number over several evenings from a stack of publicly available regulatory filings at the Polk County Extension Office. She wrote it in her blue notebook in her careful print, and she underlined it twice. She wrote the names of the disposal contractors. She wrote the disposal contract renewal dates. She wrote on a page dated August 22, '04, the estimated dollar amount that Vanderweld Dairy was paying per calendar year to dispose of milk it could not sell. The number was $138,000. She looked at that number a long time. She wrote under it the number 1,047. That was how many days she had until the balloon. She wrote under that the words, a 2-year supply chain. She circled the words. She did not go to Dale Brunner in September of '04. She did not go in October. She did not go in November. She waited. She read. She read the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture regulations governing the collection and pasteurization of Class II milk product for the purpose of feeding livestock other than the herd of origin. She read the subpart governing the required temperature and hold protocols for a batch pasteurizer of the size and vintage that was sitting in her father's equipment shed, disconnected since 1999. She read the subpart governing the record-keeping requirements. She read the subpart governing the disposal of the resulting animal-fed product if the operator failed to meet the temperature and hold protocols in any given cycle. She wrote all of it in the blue notebook. She did not go to Dale Brunner until the second week of October of 2005, which was 1 year and 5 months after she had moved home. She went to see him because a piece of information had reached her in the last week of September through Torvald Ranyard's wife, who worked the counter at the diner in Clayton, and who mentioned in the offhand way that women who work counters in dairy towns mentioned things that Vanderweld had filed early paperwork with the Polk County Zoning Office for a proposed expansion of its heifer holding barn. She had said this to Merritt while pouring her a cup of coffee at 7:15 on a Wednesday morning. She had said it with no particular emphasis. She had said it the way another woman might say, my sister is having her hip done in November. Merritt had set her fork down. She had said, how large? Ilsa Ranyard, who was 42 years old and who had known Merritt since she was 6, and who had herself buried a father to a Vanderweld price sheet in the year 1982, had looked at her a long moment. She had said, big enough that Preston Vanderweld is out at the site personally on Thursdays. Merritt had said, thank you, Ilsa. Ilsa had said, you didn't hear it from me, honey. I never do. That was on a Wednesday. The following Wednesday, Merritt Halverson drove 8 miles up the road to the Vanderweld complex, parked in the visitor lot. For the last time, walked into the front office in her father's caramel jacket and her red and cream flannel and her faded jeans and her boots, and asked to see the operations manager. Dale Brunner was 58 years old that fall. He was 6'2". He had been the operations manager at Vanderweld since 1991. He had known Eric Halverson. He had, in the spring of '99, at his own kitchen table in his own house, 6 miles east of the Vanderweld gate, told his wife that he did not like the way the price sheet was moving on the Halverson route, and his wife had said, quiet Dale, that is what your paycheck is for. And Dale Brunner had gone to work the next morning, and he had done his job. I was not a cruel man. He was not in the strict sense a bad man. He was a company man, and he had been one for 34 years. And there is a difference between a bad man and a man who has learned to look at a spreadsheet without asking who the numbers had once belonged to. Merritt walked into his office at 10:15 in the morning. She did not have an appointment. She said, "Mr. Brunner, my name is Merritt Halverson. I have a proposal." Dale Brunner looked up from a stack of transport manifests. He looked at her. He looked at the caramel jacket. He looked at the flannel. He looked at the way she held herself in the doorway of an office she had never been in. He said, "Eric's girl." "Yes, sir." He set the manifest down. He said, "I was sorry to hear about your father." "Thank you, Mr. Brunner. May I sit down?" "Please." She sat. She put her blue notebook on his desk. She said, "Your Class 2 disposal costs run to about $138,000 a year. I know that from your regulatory filings. Your tankers pass within a mile of my driveway 6 times a week. I have 80 acres of barn with empty stalls, a batch pasteurizer that has been rebuilt to state code, and a set of feeding pens that can accept up to 80 head. I am proposing that you divert all Class 2 product from your existing disposal contract to my property at no cost to you or to me. I take responsibility for the milk once it reaches my stock tank. I file the state disposal records under my operator number. You save the annual disposal fee. All I want is a contract." She stopped. Dale Brunner looked at her. He looked at the blue notebook. He looked back at her. He said, "You would be saving us money." "That is the idea, sir." He was quiet a long moment. He was a man who had learned over 34 years of running a dairy of that size to spot a con at 40 paces. What was sitting across the desk from him in a caramel jacket that had belonged to a man he had watched lose 80 acres and never lose was not a con. What was sitting across from him was a proposal that was going to save Vanderwell Dairy $138,000 a year. It was going to make his own operating budget line item on Class 2 disposal disappear at the next quarterly review. It was going to make him, if he signed it, look to Preston Vanderweld and to the board, like the operations manager who had at zero cost solved the disposal problem the compliance department had been arguing about since 2001. He said, "Miss Halverson, who is your legal representation?" "I don't have any yet, sir." "Get some. I will send you a draft contract by end of week. My general counsel is going to want to hold harmless with liability indemnification, and I recommend you have somebody read it who is on your side." "Yes, sir." "There is also the matter of the calves." Merritt did not move. She had not brought up the calves. She had waited deliberately for him to. Dale Brunner said, "We cull heifer calves each quarter that don't meet our replacement standard. Healthy animals. We don't want to spend 2 years raising them. We sell them at auction. It is a lower price than we would like. If you are going to have milk to spare and pens to fill, I could offer them to you at contract rate before they go to auction. We would save the auction commission. It is a small courtesy." Merritt said, "How many do you cull in a quarter?" He looked at a paper on his desk. He said, "Between 12 and 30, depending on the calving cycle." "How many next quarter?" He looked up. He said, 19 most likely." "I'll take all 19, at your contract rate. You want to look at their records first?" "Yes, sir, I do." "Come by the calving office Friday. Ask for a woman named Doris. She keeps every file for our replacement program. She will show you what you want to see." "Yes, sir, thank you." She stood up. She reached for the blue notebook. Dale Brunner said, "Miss Halverson." She paused. He said, "Your father was a good man. He deserved better than what happened to him." Merritt Halverson looked at Dale Brunner across a desk that was made of good oak from Wisconsin and that had been paid for indirectly by every hundredweight of milk that Vanderwell Dairy had ever bought below cost. She said, "Yes, sir, he did." She picked up the notebook. She walked out of the office. She did not know, walking out, that a man had come up the corridor behind her from the direction of the corner office and had paused half in the shadow of a doorway when he saw the caramel jacket and the red and cream flannel and the low ponytail from the back. She did not know that this man had watched her go and had then walked into Dale Brunner's office and had picked up the top page of the draft contract sitting on Dale Brunner's desk and had read the name Merritt Halverson at the top of the party of the second part line. She did not know that this man was 58 years old, that his name was Preston Vanderweld III, that he had been running the private company his grandfather had founded in 1946 for the last 11 years, that he had in the spring of 1997 personally signed off on the Polk County section road price restructuring that had 13 months later forced her father out of the milking business. She did not know that Preston Vanderweld III looked at the name Halverson on that piece of paper that Thursday morning in October of 2005, and that a small, tight smile moved across his mouth that no one else in the corridor was there to see. She did not know that he set the contract back down on Dale Brunner's desk, that he stepped back into the corridor, and that on his way back to his corner office, he stopped at the window overlooking the visitor lot, and he watched a small woman in a caramel jacket cross to a 1998 Chevy S10, get in without looking back, and drive out. She did not know that Preston Vanderweld III, standing at that window, said one word out loud to himself before he turned and walked away. He said the word, huh, just that. He said it the way a man says a thing when a thought has just started to move in the back of his head that he does not yet know the shape of. He walked back to his corner office. He sat down at his desk. He did not, in the 6 weeks that followed, mention the Halverson contract to anyone. But he did, in the 4th week of that same October, ask his personal secretary to pull the file on the Polk County Section Road buyout of 1997 and to lay the 12 original farms with rejected offers on his desk on a Monday morning. She did. He read through them one by one in the quiet of his office at 7 in the morning, and when he reached the file marked Halverson Eric 080, Acres Polk CTY, he took the file out of the stack and set it in the top drawer of his desk, and he closed the drawer. He did not tell his secretary why. She did not ask. That was on the 4th Monday of October of 2005. By that same Thursday, on the 2nd week of October, Torvald Ranyard's tanker was already backing down Merritt Halverson's driveway for the first time, and the outflow valve was already opening, and the first thousands of gallons of Class II milk were already thundering into a stainless steel stock tank that had until 3 weeks earlier been sitting empty and cold in the back corner of a barn a corporation had spent 13 months breaking a man to buy. Merritt filled a glass jar from the flow. She held it up to the pale October light. She dipped a strip of antibiotic residue paper. She wrote a number in her clipboard. She wrote the tanker ID. She wrote the batch designation. She marked the manifest with her operator number. She signed her name. She held the manifest up. Torrey Ranyard from the catwalk saw her hold it up, and he climbed down and signed the receipt half, and he tore off her copy and handed it to her, and neither of them said anything. The tank filled. The tank overflowed. The overflow ran down the outside of the tank and into the mud around Merritt's boots, because she had on purpose sized her intake pipe an inch smaller than she needed so that Torrey Ranyard would that first morning see the visible mess of it and would carry the visual back to the Vanderweld yard and would repeat it at the dispatcher's window and at the driver's shift meeting on Friday morning. And the story of the girl on County Road P, who did not step back from the spray, would enter the Vanderweld driver's rotation as a piece of talk. And by the 3rd week, the story would have traveled to every truck bay and every disposal contractor in the 8-county region. She had planned that. She had planned all of it. The second tanker at the end of the drive pulled up next. Torrey Ranyard hooked its hose. The valve opened. The tank filled and overflowed again, and Merritt sampled the second load, and she wrote the numbers, and she signed the manifest, and she filed the receipt in a metal box on the top shelf of the equipment shed, where she had also that morning placed a small brown leather-bound notebook that had been written in for the last time by a hand that was not hers in November of 1998. Under the leather notebook, she had set the blue drugstore notebook. Both books were closed. Both would be opened later that evening at the kitchen table when the tankers had gone home and the yard was empty and the light in the west was the color of a bruised peach and a barn cat named Chester. Alan had come out to lie in a patch of it and watch a young woman in a caramel jacket walk from the equipment shed to the house with 2 notebooks under her arm. That night at that same table where a man had died in a chair on a Sunday in March of 2004, Merritt Halverson would open the leather notebook to the entry dated November 14, 1998, and she would read the 5 sentences again, and then she would open the blue notebook to a fresh page, and she would write in her own careful print in a hand that was very like her father's, without ever having been trained to be 4 lines. She would write first delivery received, tank filled, Ranyard signed, 2 loads accepted. Under that, she would write Brunner is not the problem. Under that, she would write the problem is going to come from the corner office. And under that, the last line she wrote that night, she would write and underline the words her father had written in a notebook in November of '98, in the same order they appeared in his hand, and she would sign the entry with her initials and the date, October 13, 2005. And she would close the notebook, and she would go to bed in her father's bedroom, and she would sleep 6 hours without waking. She would rise at 4:30 the next morning. She would fire up the batch pasteurizer that had been sitting cold in an equipment shed since 1999. And in a set of empty stalls in a barn on 80 acres in western Wisconsin on a Friday in the second week of October of 2005, 12 calves that Vanderwell Dairy had culled from its replacement herd on the sole ground that they did not fit the profile were about to arrive on a trailer with numbered ear tags, and the tags were about to be recorded in a blue notebook in the careful print of a 24-year-old woman who had that Thursday taken the first delivery of milk she had come home to take. She would keep every tag. She would keep the number of every calf. She would keep the manifest of every tanker. She would keep in the metal box on the top shelf of the equipment shed an evidentiary record of every gallon of milk and every animal that ever crossed the property line between Vanderwell Dairy and the Halverson Place for the next 547 days. She did not know that first Thursday that the record she was starting to build was going to become the single most valuable document in western Wisconsin by the spring of 2007. She did not know that Preston Vanderweld III on the fourth Monday of October was going to open a manila folder in a drawer of his desk with her father's name on it and was going to begin a slow, patient countdown of his own. She did not know that a man named Roscoe Malochi, 39 years old, recently fired from Vanderwell Dairy under circumstances. The corporate personnel file described as insubordination. In the second degree was already on that same Thursday afternoon, sitting in a truck in the parking lot of a tavern in a town called Amory, 6 miles east of the Halverson barn, reading a newspaper article in the Clayton Weekly about a young woman on County Road P who had signed a private disposal contract with Vanderwell Dairy and drawing a small circle around her name. She did not know any of that. What she knew that first Thursday night, sitting at her father's kitchen table with 2 notebooks and a barn cat, in a patch of last light, was that her calves were coming on Friday morning, and that her pasteurizer was warm, and that her stock tank was full, and that the paragraph her father had written in November of 1998 was for the first time in 7 years no longer sitting in a drawer. It was walking on 80 acres in western Wisconsin. It had her name on it, and in the room upstairs, folded neatly in a small cedar chest at the foot of the bed she had chosen to sleep in, was her mother's old wool coat, which her mother, Sigrid Halverson, had left in the closet of that same bedroom in the summer of 1987, when Merritt was 6 years old, and which no one in the house had ever put on again. Sigrid Halverson was still alive. She lived in a small apartment above a bakery in Emery. She had not spoken to her daughter in 14 months. She would speak to her daughter again in the second week of April of 2006, for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with a corner office and a paragraph in a notebook and a spring rain on a bad calf. But we are not there yet. We are back in the second week of October of 2005 on a Thursday evening at a kitchen table in a house on 80 acres, with the light in the west, the color of a bruised peach, and a barn cat named Chester. Alan asleep on a rag rug, and a 24-year-old woman in a caramel canvas jacket, closing 2 notebooks and standing up and turning off the lamp and going upstairs to bed. The tank was full. The calves were coming. The clock in her father's ledger, the one that read 1,047 days from May of '04, had that Thursday dropped to 547. She had ahead of her 1.5 years. In a corporation with a corner office, in a manila folder in a desk drawer, and a 58-year-old man with a small, tight smile, had without knowing it yet exactly that much time to notice what was walking patient and quiet in a barn on County Road P. The 19 calves arrived on a Friday morning in the second week of October in a stock trailer painted with the same cursive V that rode the sides of the tankers, driven by a young man from the Vanderweld replacement office, who was not much older than Merritt and who was in a hurry to get back to his lunch. He backed the trailer up to the loading chute, dropped the gate, and stood with a clipboard while the calves came off in the ragged single file that calves come off in hooves clattering on the wood eyes, wide ears rotating. They were small. They were smaller than the average Vanderweld replacement heifer, and that was the whole reason they were on Merritt Halverson's chute and not in a Vanderweld barn. Each one wore a yellow plastic ear tag stamped with a 5-digit number, and above the number, the black cursive V. Merritt stood at the gate of the receiving pen, with her blue notebook open across her forearm and a stub of pencil in her right hand, and she wrote down every one of those tags before a single calf was untied. Tag 47842, tag 47843, tag 47847, tag 47851, tag 47852, tag 478, tag 47862, tag 4761, tag 4762, tag 4766, 19 tags, 19 calves, 19 numbers that if a certain man in a corner office in a complex 8 miles down the road had known what he was looking at, would have made the small hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The young driver signed her copy of the transfer manifest, took a copy for himself, tipped the brim of his cap, and drove back down the lane. Merritt watched the trailer clear her mailbox before she moved. Then she folded the manifest into the front pocket of her jeans and walked into the receiving pen and knelt down beside the smallest of the 19 calves, a black and white bull-necked little heifer whose tag read 47823. And she put her palm flat against the side of the calf's neck and she said quiet, "Welcome home." She said it twice. She said it because it was true. Every one of those calves had been born 3 to 6 months earlier in the calving parlor at Vanderweld. Every one of them had walked out of the calving pen and been ear-tagged with a Vanderweld number. Every one of them had bed Vanderweld colostrum weighed at Vanderweld intervals, and at some point in the 8 to 12 weeks before Doris, the replacement clerk, had circled her name on a cull list, had been rated by a Vanderweld genetic consultant as falling below Vanderweld's target index for their birth quarter. That target index Merritt had spent the previous 6 months of '05 learning an inside secret nobody at Vanderweld talked about outside the corporate offices, which was that it had been quietly revised 3 times in the previous decade, and each revision had raised the cutoff, which meant that a calf culled in the fall of 2005 for failing the current index would have been comfortably accepted into the Vanderweld replacement program in 1999. The 19 calves in her receiving pen, in other words, were 19 good young cows. They had been thrown out because the shape of the door had changed. She was going to walk them back through it. She spent the next 2 weeks doing nothing but calf work. She was up at 4 in the morning. She was in the pens by 4:15. She fed. She observed. She recorded weights on a Tuesday and again on a Friday because a Tuesday weight and a Friday weight plotted next to each other on graph paper could tell you a thing about a young ruminant that a single Wednesday weight could not. She marked in her blue notebook every calf that took the pasteurized milk without hesitation, and every calf that hung back, and every calf that showed a runny nose, or a soft stool, or a slight scour in the first 48 hours. She caught one early sign of coccidiosis in tag 47843 on the 6th day. She isolated the calf called Dr. Ansel Osberg and had the calf on a proper coccidiostat by that evening. Dr. Ansel Osberg was 67 years old that fall. He was a bachelor. He had been the large animal veterinarian for northwestern Polk County since 1971. He had gone through the 2-year associate program at River Falls in the same class as Eric Halverson, though Eric had left after the first year to help his own father with a bad harvest. Dr. Osberg had over the 33 years that followed treated every cow that had ever stood in the Halverson barn. He had, in the summer of 1981, delivered a calf on the concrete floor of the milking parlor at 3 in the morning with Eric holding the light and Sigrid Halverson at the kitchen table. 9 days from giving birth to a daughter, she and Eric had already privately agreed to name Merritt. I had, in other words, seen the whole thing. He drove up the Halvorsen lane on the 7th day of Merritt's operation in a green Ford F-250 that had 183,000 miles on it, and he did not say hello. Dr. Ansel Osberg was one of a small number of American men over 60 in the year 2005 who had earned the right through consistent presence to skip the pleasantries. He walked straight to the calf pens. He watched the animals for a full 3 minutes without speaking. Then he turned to Merritt and he said, "How much are you feeding them per head per day?" She said, 6 quarts, split into 2 feedings, morning and afternoon. Temperature at feed, 101 degrees at the pasteurizer discharge. Cooled to about 95 by the time it reaches the calf. Cooling rate, 6.5 minutes from the batch tank to the bottle rack. Show me the batch tank. She showed him. He walked around the pasteurizer twice. He was not a man who touched other people's equipment. He stood in front of the temperature gauge and he read it. He looked at the discharge valve. He looked at the manifold. He looked at the twin coils along the sidewall of the tank. It was quiet a long moment. He said, "Your father rebuilt this in 1991. Yes, sir. He rebuilt it because it broke a lug on the underside and the state made him replace it or shut down the parlor. Yes, sir. He used a lug he machined himself in his own equipment shed on a lathe he bought at the Osceola auction in 1984. Merritt said, "I remember." Dr. Osberg touched the side of the tank. He did not press hard. He touched it the way a very old man touches a thing that has been in a room longer than he has. I said, "The lug is fine. The coils are fine. The temperature gauge is not what it was 20 years ago, and I would put a second thermometer on the discharge line. Independent. Handheld. Every batch. Log it. Do not run a load on the gauge alone. Ever. Even one time. Even if you are tired. Do you hear me, Merritt?" She said, "Yes, sir." She wrote it in the blue notebook that afternoon. In her careful print. She underlined it twice. Every batch. 2 readings. Independent. Log both. She would 5 weeks later be very glad she had underlined it. But she did not know that yet in the second week of Osberg's visit, and she did not know that when she wrote the underlined lines. She was writing them because a man her father had trusted had told her to. That was in the last week of October of 2005. The first month of the operation ran clean. She sampled every tanker at the stock tank. She screened for antibiotic residue with the paper strips before a single gallon went into the pasteurizer. She rejected 2 loads in the first month, both because the residue strips came up positive, and she called the tanker driver, and both times the driver had driven back down the lane with an untouched load and had gone through the Vanderwell disposal process at the main gate the way the load was supposed to go through in the first place. And both times Dale Brunner had signed off on it without complaint. Tory Ranyard drove 3 of the 4 weekly deliveries that month. He watched her. He did not watch her the way men his age sometimes watch women hers. He watched her the way a man watches another professional at work. He watched her check the tanker seal before the coupling. He watched her check the temperature at the discharge. He watched her fill the sample jar. He watched her walk the jar to the equipment shed and hold it up to a light in the window and look at the color and the fat cap and the smell. On the last Thursday in October, when the second tanker of the morning had emptied and the first was already back on the road, Tory Ranyard stood at the base of Merritt's stock tank with his cap in his hand and said, "Miss Halverson." She looked up from her clipboard. He said, "I want to say something. It ain't a company thing. It's a me thing." "Say it." He said, "There was talk at the yard on Monday. Some of the drivers, not me, some of them said the disposal contract was going to go through you now, and they said, well, so now the little Halverson girl is the disposal contractor." That was the phrase. Somebody said it. And then Frank Ratzlaff, who has been driving that route for 15 years, said that girl ain't the disposal contractor. That girl is the mousetrap. And nobody said anything after that. He looked at her. He said, "I don't know what Frank meant. I don't want to know. But I want you to know that Frank said that, and I want you to know that not everybody at the yard is on the corporate side of the fence. Some of us are just driving." He put his cap back on his head. He said, "I'll be back Tuesday." He walked to his cab. He climbed up. He shut the door. He drove down the lane. Merritt stood at the base of her stock tank for a long time after his tanker had cleared the mailbox. She wrote in the blue notebook that night. She wrote it under the entry for the day's deliveries. She wrote Ratzlaff said mousetrap. Ranyard told me, "Do not forget the driver rotation." She underlined the last sentence. She did not know that night that Frank Ratzlaff was a 51-year-old union driver who had been at Vanderweld for 15 years and who had, in the second week of April of 2001, driven the last truckload of Eric Halverson's sold-off milking cows to the auction barn in Osceola, and had shaken Eric Halverson's hand at the loading chute, and had said to Eric Halverson a sentence that Eric Halverson had recorded later that night in the leather notebook in the top drawer of the roll-top desk. The sentence had been, "Eric, I do not want to be driving this trailer." She did not know that. She was going to know it before the story was over. The failure came in the last week of November. It came at 7:30 on a Wednesday morning. Merritt had run a batch through the pasteurizer at 5:15. The digital gauge on the front of the tank had read 161 degrees Fahrenheit for the full 30 minutes of the required hold. The discharge valve had opened at 5:45. She had drawn a sample. She had smelled it. She had run it through her paper tests. Everything had checked. She had fed her 3 groups of calves at 6:30. She had eaten a bowl of oatmeal at 6:45. She had walked out to the barn at 7 to start the morning weighing. At 7:30 on the concrete floor of the middle receiving pen, 3 calves were standing in ways she had not seen them stand before. Tag 47822 had her head down. Tag 47825 had a wet flank that Merritt could see from 20 feet away, and that was not water. Tag 47829 was pressed against the far side of the pen, and when Merritt came into the pen and knelt down beside her, the calf's eyes did not focus. Merritt did not move for 3 seconds. Then she moved fast. She went to the phone in the equipment shed. She called Dr. Ansel Ostberg. It was 7:34. He picked up on the second ring. He said only where. She said middle pen, 3 of them. Scours, 1 is depressed. He said isolate, warm milk with electrolytes, not straight milk. I am 40 minutes out. He hung up. She isolated the 3 calves. She moved them into a small back stall she had swept the previous week for exactly this purpose. She hooked up a hose from the utility sink. She warmed the electrolyte mix on the barn hot plate. She got fluid into tag 47829 first because 47829 was the one who was not looking at her. She got fluid into 47825 second. She got fluid into 47822 last. She wrote every minute of what she was doing on a clipboard hooked over the stall gate. Dr. Osberg came up the lane at 8:11. He did not go to the calves first. He went to the pasteurizer. Merritt followed him. He walked to the front of the tank. He read the digital temperature gauge, which was at that moment showing the resting temperature of an empty tank ambient, plus a few degrees. He walked around to the manifold side. He pulled a small handheld probe thermometer out of his jacket pocket. It was old. It was analog. It was the same probe he had carried on farm calls since about 1990. He said, "Fire it up." Merritt turned the tank on. She filled it per protocol with 200 gallons of fresh Class 2 product from the stock tank outside. She sealed the lid. She engaged the heating cycle. The digital gauge climbed. It reached 161 degrees Fahrenheit at 8:19. It stayed there. It stayed there for the full 30 minutes of the mandated hold. Dr. Osberg watched the gauge. At 8:35, 6 minutes into the hold, he unclipped the small analog probe from his belt and slid it into the manifold port. He watched it come to temperature. He waited. He read it. He read it again. He turned it so Merritt could see. The analog probe read 153 degrees Fahrenheit. The digital gauge on the front of the tank read 161 degrees Fahrenheit. There was an 8-degree gap, 8 degrees. 8 degrees was the difference in a batch pasteurizer of that vintage between fully killing every pathogen. The state code was designed to kill and not killing them. 8 degrees was the difference between a healthy calf and a scouring calf. 8 degrees was the difference, if Dale Brunner ever heard about it, and if his corporate counsel ever heard about it, between a running disposal contract and a shutdown operation and an emergency inspection by the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture that would end her business inside a week. Dr. Osberg pulled the probe out. He wiped it on a clean rag. He clipped it back to his belt. He said, "Your gauge is lying to you, Merritt." She said, "How long?" "I do not know how long. Could be a month, could be a week, could be 2 hours before you ran your last clean batch. Doesn't matter. It's lying now. What matters is what you do next." She said, "I'm going to lose calves. Maybe, maybe not. Get me a good Ceftio schedule started on all 3 in the back stall by 9. Keep them isolated for 10 days. Watch the rest of the group. Twice-a-day temp checks on every one of them for a week. And I want your entire calf feed record for the last 4 weeks laid out on your kitchen table by 5 o'clock this afternoon, because we are going to trace exactly which batches went to which pen and figure out how deep this goes before your Friday deliveries." "Yes, sir." He looked at her a moment. He said, "You will not lose them all. Merritt, this is a bad day. It is not a broken day. Do you hear me? She said, yes, sir. He walked back to his truck. He drove down the lane. Merritt stood in the equipment shed with the tank running behind her and the digital gauge reading 161 and the analog probe on the workbench reading, if she picked it up and clipped it back in, 153. And she felt the specific stillness of a person who has just found out that the wall she was leaning against was not as it turned out a wall. She did not cry. She had, since the first Sunday of March of 2004, run out of the specific kind of crying that a day like that was supposed to produce. She had run out of it standing in an empty milking parlor. She had run out of it again sitting at a kitchen table with a leather notebook. She had run out of it in ways that she was going to spend the next 20 years of her life trying to remember how to have back. What she felt in the equipment shed that Wednesday morning was cold and specific. She thought, all right. She thought, so this is the first one. She thought there will be others. Do not react. Trace, fix, record. She unclipped the digital thermometer housing from the front of the tank. She unscrewed the 4 small brass bolts that held it in place. She lifted the housing off. She looked at the sensor. The sensor was clean. The sensor was in perfect physical condition. But at the base of the sensor housing on the inside face of the mounting bracket, someone had, in the recent past, applied a small drop of something that looked to Merritt Halverson's eye like clear silicone-based insulation gel. It was not corrosion. It was not scale. It was a translucent gel about the size of a dime, and it was sitting exactly where it would prevent the sensor probe from making full thermal contact with the interior wall of the tank. And it was in a place that no manufacturer would ever have installed anything. Merritt stood in front of the pasteurizer with the sensor housing in her hand and a piece of silicone, insulated sensor gel visible on the mounting bracket, and she thought a thing she was not going to say out loud for another 7 weeks. She thought somebody put this here. She thought this is not a manufacturing defect. This is not a broken sensor. This is a piece of gel that somebody put on this mounting bracket on purpose so that this gauge would read high and so that any batch I ran through this tank would appear to be pasteurizing when it was not, and so that eventually a calf would go down, and eventually the state would come out, and eventually the operation would be shut down. She closed her hand around the gel. She did not remove it. Not yet. She did not clean the sensor. Not yet. She left the gel in place. She reattached the housing. She screwed the 4 brass bolts back in. She walked into the house. She walked into the small back office where the roll-top desk was. She opened the leather notebook her father had left in the top drawer. She opened it to the last written page, the one dated November 14 of 1998, the page with the 5 sentences about the pile and the calves and the 2 years. She turned to the next blank page. She picked up her father's fountain pen from the pen tray on the desk, the same pen he had used to write that entry, still lying in the same place he had left it 7 years earlier. She uncapped it. She wrote in her own careful print, in an ink not quite the same shade as her father's, but as close as an old pen with new ink is ever going to get 3 lines. They did not want me to succeed. The gel is proof. They came onto this ground. She dated it. November 23, 2005. She signed her initials. She capped the pen. She put it back in the tray. She closed the notebook. She walked out to the barn. She got the CEFT-IOFER schedule started on tags 47812, 47825, and 47829 by 8:58. She lost none of them. Tag 47829, the one who had not focused, took the longest to come back. But by the middle of December, 47829 was on her feet, was eating, was gaining weight, and was at the January weigh-in only 19 pounds behind the group average. The other 2 were within a normal range by Christmas. She did not lose a calf that fall. She did lose something else. She lost, over the 10 days of nursing those 3 animals, back the last small piece of a girl who still believed in some part of her that the story her father had lost had been a story about numbers and about a bad market and about a corporation that had been at bottom simply doing what corporations do. She had not, until she saw that drop of clear silicone-insulated sensor gel, understood that a corporation could also be a thing that came onto your ground. She was going to understand it now. The name Roscoe Malocci appeared for the first time in her blue notebook on a Sunday afternoon in the second week of December. It appeared because Tory Ranyard on that Sunday drove up her lane in his personal pickup and not in a tanker, and knocked on her kitchen door at 3:15 in the afternoon. Ilse Ranyard was with him. They both took off their caps at the door. Merritt brought them in and set coffee on the table. Tori said, "Miss Halvorson, I got something I want to say, and I want to say it here, and I want to say it once." She said, "Go on." He said, "Ilse and me been talking. She hears things at the diner. Frank Ratzlaff has been in there twice a week, and Frank does not sit at the counter and drink coffee for pleasure. Frank drinks coffee at the counter when he wants to be heard by whoever comes in. Frank has been saying out loud in front of the 7 o'clock breakfast crowd that there is a man named Roscoe Malochi who was let go from Vanderweld in the fall of '04 for what corporate called insubordination in the second degree. Frank has been saying that Maloche worked in the equipment maintenance rotation. Frank has been saying that Maloche knows the disposal processing station, the compliance lab equipment, and the way a corporate sensor housing comes off a tank." He looked at Merritt. He said, "Frank does not say things at the counter unless he wants somebody in the county to know them. I think Frank has been saying them at me, because Frank knows I drive your route. So I am telling you what Frank has been saying. I am not telling you what to do with it." Merritt said, "Where does Maloche live?" Ilse Ranyard said, quiet. "He rents a room over the tavern in Ameri, above the river bend. He is there most afternoons after 3. Merritt said, "Ilse, thank you." After 3. Merritt said, "Ilse, thank you." Ilse said, "Honey," that was all. They drank their coffee. They talked for 18 minutes about the weather and the price of feed corn, and about Ilse's sister, who had that fall had a hip put in and was still not walking right. Then Tori and Ilse Ranyard put their caps back on and walked out to the pickup and drove down the lane, and Merritt stood in the kitchen and watched them go. And she wrote the name Roscoe Malochi in the blue notebook. And she wrote the address above the Riverbend Tavern in Amory, and she wrote a single line under the address. "Do not go alone." She did not go alone. She went the next Wednesday afternoon in the last week before Christmas of 2005. And she went with Dr. Ansel Osberg in his F-250. She did not tell Dr. Osberg where they were going until they were 3 miles east of Clayton on County Road N. When she told him, Dr. Osberg did not argue and did not turn the truck around. He said only, "Do you have the gel?" She said, "In an evidence jar in my jacket pocket." I said, "All right then." The Riverbend was a 2-story frame tavern that had in 1964 been a general store. It sat at the elbow of a small county road in the town of Amory, Wisconsin, population approximately 2,800. The building had 6 upstairs rooms that were rented by the month to men who did not have anywhere else to be. Merritt and Dr. Osberg walked in at 2:50 on a Wednesday afternoon. Osberg went to the bar and ordered a coffee and asked in the specific low voice of a man who has been doing farm calls in a small town for 34 years whether Roscoe Maloche was in. The bartender looked at him a long moment. The bartender said, "Roscoe is upstairs, Doc." Osberg said, "Which room?" "Number 4. They went up the stairs. Room 4 had a door with a brass number 4 screwed to it and a hallway light that had one bulb burned out. Merritt knocked. She knocked twice, small and steady. The door opened. Roscoe Maloche was 39 years old that December. I was 5'10". He had the thin frame of a man who had for several months been drinking his lunch instead of eating it. He had dark blonde hair cut short and a beard that had not been trimmed in about 3 weeks. He was wearing a green flannel shirt and gray sweatpants. He had socks on, but no boots. He looked at Merritt. He looked at Dr. Osberg. His face did not change. He said, "Halverson's girl." Merritt said, "Roscoe Maloche." "Come in." They came in. The room was small. It had a bed, a wooden chair, a card table, and a small refrigerator. The window looked out at the alley behind the riverbend. There were on the card table 7 manila folders, a legal pad, and a coffee mug the size of a soup bowl. The manila folders were labeled in blue felt tip pen with dates and dollar amounts, the way a man labels a folder when he has been building a case for a long time and has decided he is not going to let the case out of his sight even in his own room. Merritt did not look at the folders yet. She reached into the pocket of her caramel jacket. She took out a small glass jar with a plastic lid. Inside the jar, sealed with a piece of clear packing tape across the mouth, was a piece of clear silicone-insulated sensor gel about the size of a dime. She set the jar on the card table. She said, "You put this on my father's pasteurizer." Roscoe Maloche looked at the jar. He looked at it for a long time. He said, I did. She said, why? I was quiet a long moment. He said, Miss Halverson, I am going to tell you something now, and I am going to tell you the truth. I am not going to justify it. I am going to tell you what I thought, and I am going to tell you what I know now, and I am going to tell you what is in those folders. He sat down at the card table. He put his hands on the top of it, palms flat, the way a man does when he wants the person across from him to know he is not reaching for anything. He said, in the last week of September of '05, 3 weeks before your first delivery, Preston Vanderweld III put out a memo to the operations manager and to the disposal contracting office and to the legal office. It said in about 6 lines that a new disposal party had been identified in Polk County. It said that the party was a small, unaligned operator. It said that the board would evaluate the contract at the March review. It said in one line at the bottom that any operational disruption at the receiving end of the disposal chain that might arise in the ordinary course of the operator's first 6 months was not to be treated as a compliance concern by Vanderweld, but was to be documented, dated, and forwarded to Preston's office for review. I looked at Merritt. He said, I saw the memo. I was still inside. This was a week before they fired me. I did not know who you were. I did not know your name was Halverson. I did not know your father. What I knew was that Preston Vanderweld III had 10 years earlier ended my father's small mineral and limestone operation over in St. Croix County using the same 3-step process. And what I knew when I read that memo was that he was already building the paperwork trail he was going to use to shut down whatever operation had just signed onto his disposal chain. He said, so I made a decision. I made a bad decision. I went out on my last equipment maintenance rotation, and I put a piece of gel on a sensor bracket in a pasteurizer at what was at that time an address I did not know the name of, because I thought if the operation was one of Preston's shell fronts, the operation was going to be shut down by the state and would take Preston's disposal chain paperwork with it. I did not think of it as sabotaging a real farmer. I thought of it as sabotaging Preston. He looked at the jar. He said, then I got let go. Insubordination in the second degree. I was let go because I had, in a conversation with Dale Brunner, said that Preston Vanderweld III was by my count going to run 4 to 6 more small operators off their ground in Polk County in the next 5 years, and that Dale ought to be watching for it. Dale wrote it up. I do not fault Dale for that. Dale did his job. I said in November when the first Halverson invoices came through the disposal processing station, I heard the name, Halverson, Eric Halverson. I put it together, and I realized what I had done. He looked at Merritt. He said, you are not one of Preston's shell fronts, are you? Merritt said, no, sir, I am not. I know that now. I did not know it then. She said, why did you not come to me directly, Mr. Maloche? He said, because I have been afraid for 2 months that you had noticed the gel and that you had already called the sheriff and that the sheriff was going to knock on this door before I could open the folders. I have been sitting in this room with the folders open on the table for 8 weeks, and I have been waiting for one of 2 knocks, yours or theirs. He said, I would rather it was yours. He turned the top folder on the card table around so that it faced Merritt and Dr. Osberg. He said, there are 7 farms in these folders. There are also 6 others I have documentation on, but not the full paper trail. Every one of them is a small operator in Polk or St. Croix County who lost their operating margin to a Vanderweld price restructuring between 1989 and 2003. Every one of them was eventually approached with a below-market offer on their land. Every one of them either sold or in 3 cases held out and lost the ground at a foreclosure sale that Vanderweld attended. I have the Vanderweld internal price sheets. I have the memos. I have the offer letters. Some of them are in his own hand. He tapped the top folder. He said, the name on this folder is Halverson. Merritt did not move. She looked at the folder for a long moment. She looked up at Roscoe Maloche. She said, may I take these? He said, they are yours. I am not the one who was supposed to have them. I am the one who saw the memo and made a bad choice with a piece of gel. You are the one whose father is in that top folder. She said, Mr. Maloche. He said, Miss Halverson. She said, I do not forgive you for the censor. I need you to know that. Your gel put 3 of my calves in isolation. It cost me $2,000 in vet bills. It cost me sleep. It could have cost me the operation. I do not forgive you, not yet. But I am not going to the sheriff, and I am not going to Dale Brunner, and I am going to take the folders. Because the folders belong to the people whose names are on them, and one of those names is my father, and you have been holding them here for 2 months, which is longer than the average man in your position would have held them. She said, "Do you understand me?" He said, "Yes, ma'am, I do." She said, "I want your address in this room. I want a way to reach you. I want you to sit here, and I want you to stay sober, and I want you to be findable. Because if I ever need testimony on what is in these folders or on the memo from September of '05, I am going to need you to say it out loud in front of a person who is writing it down. Do you understand me?" He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Do not put another piece of gel on another piece of equipment for the rest of your life, Mr. Maloche." He said, "No, ma'am, I will not." She picked up the folders. Dr. Osberg helped her carry them. They walked out of the Riverbend Tavern in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon in the last week before Christmas of 2005, carrying 7 manila folders full of the paperwork trail of a corporation and one small glass jar with a piece of silicone sensor gel in it, and they got in the Ford F-250, and Dr. Osberg drove them home without saying anything for the first 11 miles. At the 11th mile, he said, "Quiet, Merritt." She said, "Yes, sir." I said, "This is bigger than a milking parlor now." She said, "I know it is." He said, "You are 24 years old." She said, "I know." He said, "Do you know what to do with it?" She said, "No, sir, but I know what not to do with it. I am not going to the newspaper. I am not going to a lawyer. Not this year. This year I raise the calves. The calves are the case. Everything else is testimony." Dr. Ansel Osberg drove for another mile without speaking. Then he laughed once dry and small the way a very old country vet laughs when he has just heard a 24-year-old say a thing that he himself has been waiting 30 years to hear somebody say out loud. He said, "Your father would have known better than to try to argue with you right now." She said, "I know he would have." They drove the rest of the way home in silence. At her kitchen table that evening, she opened the 7 folders one by one, and she read every page in every folder. And by 3 in the morning, she had in the blue notebook a handwritten index of every farm, every date, every internal memo number, every price restructuring, and every offer letter. And she had at the end of the index one sentence. The sentence was, "He came for Papa in '97 because Papa said no." She underlined it. The mystery of the censor was that night closed. The mystery of the corner office had that night opened. But mysteries were not the only things that opened in the winter of '05 and '06. Preston Vanderweld III had in the first week of January of 2006 opened the manila folder in his own top desk drawer. The one marked Halverson Eric O., 80 acres Polk CTY, and he had looked at the 80-acre plat map for a long moment, and he had done something he had not done in almost 8 years. He had picked up his phone, he had called his personal secretary, he had said, "Get me an appointment with the Halverson daughter, here, at the office, my schedule, late January." His secretary had said, "Yes, sir," on what pretext? Preston Vanderweld had said, quiet, "A private acquisition discussion." He had hung up. He had put the folder back in the drawer. And on a Tuesday morning in the 4th week of January of 2006, on a cold, clear day with wind coming down out of Canada, across the frozen fields of northern Polk County, a small woman in a caramel canvas jacket was going to walk into the corner office of Vanderwell Dairy, and she was going to be offered $195,000 for 80 acres of ground and a barn full of 19 tagged heifers, and she was going to read every line of the offer very carefully before she picked up a pen. But we are not there yet. We are still at a kitchen table in the last week of December of 2005 at 3 in the morning with 7 manila folders open and a fan across the surface, and a blue notebook open at the last page, and a young woman in a red and cream flannel shirt closing the notebook and putting her head down on her folded arms. And for the first time since the Sunday afternoon in March of 2004, when her father had died sitting up in a chair sleeping without dreaming in a house on 80 acres in western Wisconsin, on the last stretch of a road that ran 8 miles between a town called Clayton and a complex of 3 barns that would in less than 15 months come looking to buy back what they had once tried to make sure nobody would ever be able to grow. The corner office of Vanderwell Dairy sat on the 3rd floor of the administrative building above the receiving lab and above the human resources rotation at the end of a corridor with green industrial carpet and a row of framed black and white photographs of Vanderweld cows from the 1950s. Merritt Halverson walked that corridor on a Tuesday morning in the fourth week of January of 2006 in her father's caramel canvas jacket and her red and cream flannel and a pair of clean jeans she had washed the night before, carrying a slim manila envelope of her own under her left arm and a small blue notebook in her right hand. The receptionist at the end of the corridor looked up. She said, "Miss Halverson, Mr. Vanderweld is expecting you." Merritt said, "Yes, ma'am." She stepped through the door. Preston Vanderweld III rose from behind a walnut desk that was by Merritt's estimate about the size of the workbench in her equipment shed. He was 58 years old that January. He was 5'10". He was wearing a charcoal wool suit with no tie, an open collar white shirt, and a pair of shell cordovan loafers that had been resold twice at a shop in Chicago. He had gray hair cut short at the sides and a face that had in the last decade learned to look at people the way an appraiser looks at a piece of furniture at an estate sale. He said, "Miss Halverson, thank you for coming." She said, "Mr. Vanderweld." She did not extend her hand. He did not extend his either. There is a way one careful adversary greets another, and it does not require the pretense of a handshake. He gestured to a chair. She sat. He sat. He opened a leather portfolio on his desk. From the portfolio, he removed a document that was 14 pages long and bound with a plastic comb. He said, "I will not waste your time, Miss Halverson. My company has been assembling parcels in Polk County for approximately 18 months. Your parcel is contiguous with 3 we have already acquired. We are interested in it. I am prepared personally to offer $195,000 for the 80 acres, the improvements, and the 19 head of stock currently on the property. Cash at closing, 60-day close. That would clear your note at First Farmers Bank, which I understand has a balloon due in April of '07, and it would leave you a distribution of approximately $148,000 free and clear at 24 years old." He set the document on the desk between them. He said, "Take your time. Read it. I am not asking for a signature today." Merritt did not touch the document. She said, "Mr. Vanderweld, before I read it, I have a question. Please. Did my father decline an offer from you in the fall of 1997? Preston Vanderweld's face did not change. "I," said Miss Halverson, "your father was a member of a section road milk buying group whose contracts my company acquired in the fall of '97. There was a routine offer made to a number of the operators on that route. Your father was one of them. He declined. I do not remember every detail of every offer we have made in the last 20 years. He said it without a flicker. He said it the way a man says a thing he has rehearsed inside himself for so many years that it has stopped being a lie in his own hearing. Merritt said the offer was for $85,000 for 80 acres. Preston said that sounds plausible. The offer was made on October 22, 1997. He looked at her. She said the offer was made 2 weeks after the fourth quarterly price restructuring of 1997, which lowered the paid rate on Class 1 product moving through the Polk County section road route by $4.12 per hundredweight, effective retroactively to the first of the calendar year. His face did not move. She said between January of 1998 and November of 1998. My father's operating margin on his 42-cow tie stall dairy went from a positive 9 cents per hundredweight to a negative $1.34 per hundredweight. In April of '99, 6 months after he sold the herd, he refinanced the last of what he had left in the ground to pay for the roof, the well, and the septic. In April of '02, at the balloon of that refinance, he took out a second note at First Farmers for $47,000. That is the note whose balloon comes due in April of '07. That is the note you are now offering to clear for me at a total transaction that would net me $148,000 in exchange for the 80 acres you originally offered $85,000 for. Preston Vanderweld III looked at Merritt Halverson across the walnut desk. He said, "You have done your reading." She said, "Yes, sir, I have." I was quiet a long moment. He was calculating. He was in that moment calculating a great many things at once, including the specific number of internal memos his personal secretary had access to, and the specific number of Vanderweld drivers with union protection who had known his father, and the specific probability that a 24-year-old woman in a caramel canvas jacket sitting across from him at his own desk had by January of 2006 arrived at a set of factual claims by accident. He said, "Miss Halverson, I am going to be direct with you." She said, "Please." He said, "The offer in front of you is generous. It reflects the strategic value of the parcel to my company. It reflects the fact that I would prefer to acquire the property through a friendly transaction rather than at a foreclosure sale in April of '07, which would be an option available to my company if the balloon note went unpaid. It reflects the personal courtesy I am extending to the daughter of a former section road operator." He tapped the document. He said, "It comes with terms." "What terms?" "On page 11, paragraph 3, there is a non-competition clause. It restricts you from operating a licensed dairy or dairy-adjacent operation within a 50-mile radius of the Vanderweld processing complex for a period of 10 years from the date of closing." Uh-huh. On page 12, paragraph 1, there is a records transfer clause. It requires you to convey to my company at closing all animal identification records, feed, and pasteurization logs, tanker manifests, and internal correspondence related to the operation currently housed on the parcel. Uh-huh. On page 13, paragraph 2, there is a general release clause, standard language. It provides that upon closing you release my company, its officers and its predecessors, from any and all claims, actions, or proceedings, whether now existing or hereafter arising, related to any dealings between my company and any member of the Halverson family dating from the date of incorporation of Vanderweld Dairy to the date of closing. Merritt did not move. She said, "Would you say that last one again, sir?" Preston Vanderweld said it again. She said, "So under the terms of this offer, if I sign, I release your company from any claim I might ever bring on behalf of my father." He said, "That is the language, yes." She said, "You are asking me to sell you 80 acres and 19 calves and a set of records for $195,000 on the condition that I never speak against your company for what it did to my father in '97. He said, "I am asking you to sign a standard general release that would allow this transaction to close cleanly. I am not asking you to characterize the release in the terms you have just used." She looked at him a long moment. She said, "Mr. Vanderweld." He said, "Miss Halverson." She said, "I need to think about it." He said, "Of course, take a week, take two. My offer is open through the end of February." She said, "May I take the document?" He said, "Please." She picked up the document. She stood up. She said, "Thank you for your time, Mr. Vanderweld." He said, "Miss Halverson, may I ask you something?" She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "How did you know about the fourth quarterly restructuring of '97? She looked at him a long moment. She said, "My father kept notebooks, Mr. Vanderweld." She walked out. She walked back down the corridor with the framed black and white photographs of Vanderweld cows from the 1950s. She walked past the receptionist who nodded at her. She walked down the stairwell, past the receiving lab, past the human resources rotation, and out through the front lobby into the parking lot where her 1998 Chevy S10 was parked in the visitor lane between a red Ford Ranger and a silver company sedan. She did not get in the truck right away. She stood at the driver's side door in the January cold, with the folded document in her hand and the blue notebook in her jacket pocket. And she let herself, for exactly 15 seconds, feel the specific pull of $148,000. She let herself feel what it would feel like to write a single check to First Farmers Bank and walk out of the branch office of Odette Halmstad with the deed marked paid. She let herself feel what it would feel like to close her father's leather notebook permanently and put it on a high shelf and not think about it again. She let herself feel it for 15 seconds. Then she got in the truck. She drove home. That evening at the kitchen table, she opened the document to page 13, paragraph 2, and she read the release clause 3 times, and then she read the non-competition clause, and then she read the records transfer clause, and then she picked up her father's fountain pen from the pen tray on the desk. Uncapped it, walked back to the kitchen table and wrote across the top of page 1, in her own careful hand, a single word. No. She wrote her initials under it. She dated it. January 24th, 2006. She did not tear up the document. She folded it. She put it in a large manila envelope. She put the envelope in the metal box on the top shelf of the equipment shed next to Roscoe Maloche's 7 folders and next to her father's leather notebook and next to the small glass jar with the silicone sensor gel in it. She was building an archive. She did not yet know that the archive would matter more than any single one of its pieces. She was going to. Her mother came to Clayton in the second week of April of 2006. Sigrid Halverson was 53 years old that spring. She was 5'2". She had gray blonde hair cut just above the shoulders and pale blue eyes and the specific way of holding her shoulders that a woman develops when she has spent the last 2 decades trying not to be recognized in her own hometown. She lived at that point in a small apartment above a bakery in Emery, 12 miles east of Clayton, and she had not been up her ex-husband's driveway since the summer of 1998, 6 months before the paragraph in the leather notebook was written. She came that April because a man in a walnut desk office in the Vandervelde complex had in the last week of March called her by telephone and had explained to her in the specific patient voice of a man who has been dealing with reluctant sellers for 18 years that her daughter was refusing an offer of $195,000 for the family land, and that as a co-heir of the Halverson estate, she had a legal interest in any decision Merritt made about the deed. That was the phone call. Sigrid Halverson was not in fact a co-heir of the Halverson estate. Eric Halverson had in the fall of 2003, 6 months before his stroke, quietly retitled the deed of the 80 acres to reflect his sole ownership of record, which had been the actual legal situation since the divorce filing of '98, in which the recorder's office had been slow to update. Preston Vandervelde III either did not know this or knew it, and did not care because his phone call to Sigrid was not strictly about the deed. His phone call to Sigrid was about a wedge. He had over a career learned that no wedge worked as well on a young woman as the sudden appearance at her kitchen table of the mother who had left when she was 6. Sigrid Halverson came up the driveway in a 1992 Buick LeSabre the color of an oyster shell. She parked at the top of the yard. She got out. She stood in the driveway for a full minute looking at the barn, looking at the house, looking at the small wooden sign Merritt had painted in December and hung at the mailbox that read, Halvorsen Class 2, Collection and Calf Rearing. Please call ahead. Then she walked to the porch. Merritt came to the door in the flannel and the jeans with a rag in her hand from cleaning the pasteurizer manifold. Mother and daughter looked at each other through the screen for a long moment. Sigrid said, Merritt. Merritt said, Mama. Sigrid said, May I come in? Merritt unlatched the screen. They sat at the kitchen table. Merritt did not make coffee. She did not offer coffee. She did not need to. Sigrid Halverson, in the specific way of a woman who has been rehearsing a difficult conversation in the LeSabre for 12 miles, went straight to what she had come to say. She said, Merritt, a man from Vandervelde called me last week. Merritt said, I know. Sigrid said, you know. I know. He told me at the meeting he was going to call you. I have been waiting. Sigrid looked at her a moment. She said, he said the offer was $195. He said you turned it down. I did. Merritt, that is $148,000 free and clear after the note. You could go back to school. You could take your grandmother to Norway the way she always talked about. You could have a life. You could have a life that is not this. Merritt looked at her mother across the table. She looked at her a long time. She said, Mama, you do not know why I turned it down. Sigrid said, Merritt, honey, I do not need to know why. I need to know that you understand what $148,000 means. Your father spent his entire life trying to earn a fraction of that in a single year, and he could not do it. And a man is offering it to you in a lump sum for 80 acres that never earned it in the first place. That is what I need you to understand. Merritt said, the offer comes with a general release, Mama. Sigrid said, a what? A general release. On page 13. If I sign, I am agreeing that I will never bring any claim on my behalf or on Papa's behalf against Vandervelde Dairy for anything they did to him in 1997 or after. Sigrid Halverson was quiet for a long moment. She said, what did they do to him in '97, Merritt? Merritt stood up. She walked to the little back office. She came back with the leather notebook. She sat down across from her mother. She opened the notebook to the entries of 1997 and 1998, and she turned the notebook around and she slid it across the table. She said, read it, Mama. Every page. Take as long as you need. I will make coffee. Sigrid Halverson read for 41 minutes. Merritt made coffee. Merritt refilled her mother's cup twice. Merritt sat at the far end of the kitchen and did not speak. When Sigrid was done, she closed the notebook. She looked at it. She put her hand flat on the cover. She said, "Oh, Eric." She said it 3 times. She said it in a voice that Merritt had not heard her use since Merritt was 5 years old. And she said it into a room where the man to whom she was speaking had been dead for 22 months. Then she took her hand off the notebook. She sat up. She took a very long breath. She looked at her daughter. She said, "Merritt." "Yes, Mama. I am going to say something, and I am going to mean it, and I am going to only say it once." "Yes, Mama." Sigrid Halverson said, "Do not sign that release. Not for $1, not for 1 million. If I ever hear that you sign that release, I will drive back up this driveway, and I will burn the check in the yard before you can cash it." Merritt did not move. Sigrid said, "Do you hear me, Merritt?" Merritt said, "Yes, Mama." Sigrid stood up. She said, "I have to go. I need to think. I do not know how to be your mother anymore. I have not known for a very long time. But I know how to know when a man has stolen from us. And I know now." Merritt stood up. Sigrid walked to the door. At the door she turned. She said, "Merritt, if you need me, I am at the bakery, in Ameri, above the ovens, room number 7. Merritt said, "I know where you are, Mama." Sigrid walked to the LeSabre. She got in. She drove down the driveway. She did not come back to Clayton for 4 months. But the phone call Preston Vanderweld III had been counting on to open a wedge in Merritt Halverson's family had that April afternoon closed a wedge that had been open in that family for 20 years. And Preston Vanderweld III did not know it. And Preston Vanderweld III would not know it, in fact, until the very last morning of his transaction, when he sat down across from Merritt Halverson at a walnut desk for the second time and saw in the small stubborn set of her jaw that the wedge had gone the other way. That was in April of 2006. Merritt went back to the calves. The 19 calves were by that April 6-month-old heifers in strong condition. She had in the intervening winter added 28 more from the Vanderweld cull cycles of December and February. Every one of them was on the Halvorsen protocol pasteurized class 2 milk fed twice a day at 95 degrees with the pasteurizer running under Dr. Osberg's dual thermometer rule. A set feeding schedule that Merritt tracked to the minute. An antibiotic-free treatment record from birth. A Wisconsin state standard vaccination sequence at 2, 4, and 8 weeks of age. And a weight curve that Merritt plotted twice a week in the blue notebook. She kept every tag. She kept in a separate ledger a linked record between each animal's original Vanderweld tag and a supplemental Halverson tag she had begun applying in the second month of the operation on a separate ear in a different color. When the day came for a heifer to leave the property, both tags would be recorded on the transfer manifest. There would be no way at that later moment for anyone to argue about where any of these animals had come from. The Halvorsen operation by the last week of April of 2006 had 47 calves in 3 age groups. The Vanderweld expansion, by the same last week of April, had a signed permit from the Polk County Zoning Board and a poured concrete footing on the east side of the existing heifer barn. Steel arrived in June. The new barn was framed in 10 weeks. Interior work ran through August and into September. The county inspection for occupancy was scheduled for the last week of March of 2007. The math of the thing from Preston Vanderweld's side of the walnut desk was straightforward. The new heifer barn had 200 stalls. Vanderweld, in the ordinary course, held back a percentage of its own heifer calves every quarter for internal replacement, but the replacement queue for that number of stalls, given the current culling rate, was going to run about 59 heads short at the opening date. The company needed 59 bred springing heifers of known genetic background, ready to enter the new barn between the last week of March and the first week of April of 2007. The outside market for springing heifers of that specification, that spring in the upper Midwest, was thin. Prices from Minnesota were up. Prices from Iowa were up. Health certificates and transport were adding another $230 per head. And the timeline was tight. Dale Brunner ran the numbers at his desk 3 times in the second week of March of 2007. He looked at the number. He looked at the calendar. He picked up the phone. He called the acquisitions office at 3 sister dairies in Minnesota and 1 in western Iowa. He got quotes back within 48 hours. Every quote was above his budget line. Every quote had a lead time of 6 to 9 weeks. Every quote came with a health protocol he was going to have his own vet team validate. He put the phone down. He sat at his desk for a long moment. Then he did the thing that Preston Vanderweld III had, from the corner office one floor above him, spent the previous 18 months quietly praying he would not do. He got up. He walked out to the loading yard. He found Tory Ranyard leaning against the side of his tanker with a cup of coffee. He said, "Ranyard." Tory said, "Mr. Brunner." Dale said, "You still running the Halverson route Thursdays?" "Yes, sir." "How many head is she running up there?" Tory Ranyard set his coffee down on the running board of the tanker. He said, "I've counted, sir, roughly, from the trailer window. And I make it about 60. 60. Give or take a few. It's hard to see the back pen from the driveway." Dale said, "How many of those look springing, would you say?" Tory Ranyard looked at Dale Brunner. He said, "Sir, she had a vet up there in late January for a full pregnancy check on the whole herd. I know because I was on the drive that morning, and Doc Osberg's truck was in her yard when I pulled up. I do not know what percent came back bred, but Doc Osberg was there 4 hours. I would guess a high number of them are due between April and June." Dale said, "How do you know that?" Tory said, "Because Ilsa told me. She had breakfast with Doc Osberg that Saturday. Doc was proud of the girl. Doc said, 'If that whole herd don't come back bred, I'll eat my hat.' Those were his exact words." Dale Brunner stood in the loading yard of Vanderwell Dairy on a cold Wednesday morning in the middle of March of 2007, next to a tanker driver named Torvald Ranyard, and he said, "Quiet, Ranyard. Do not repeat this conversation." Tory said, "No, sir." Dale went back to his office. He shut his door. He called the corner office. He did not put his call through the switchboard. He walked upstairs. He knocked on the frame of Preston Vanderweld III's open door. Preston looked up. Dale said, "We have a supply option in the county I would like to walk over to." Preston said, "Sit down, Dale." Dale sat down. Preston said, "Tell me." Dale told him. Preston Vanderweld III listened to the whole thing without interrupting. At the end of it, he was quiet for a very long moment. Then he said, "How many head?" Dale said, 60, give or take. Most likely bred. Local. Known dam lines. Vaccinated on the Wisconsin state protocol. Handled through pasteurized milk rearing from 12 weeks. Records complete. And every one of them carrying our own original ear tag. Preston Vanderweld III put his hands flat on the walnut desk. He said, "Quiet, Dale. Go up there. Drive up yourself. Do not send Doris. Do not send counsel. Drive up yourself. Walk the pens. Count the tags. And come back here and tell me what you saw." Dale said, "Yes, sir." Preston said, "Dale?" Dale said, "Yes, sir." Preston said, "Do not shake her hand until you have come back to this office." Dale said, "Yes, sir." Dale Brunner drove up the Halverson Lane at 9:40 on a Thursday morning in the third week of March of 2007. He did not call ahead. Merritt was in the equipment shed cleaning the pasteurizer manifold. She saw the Vanderweld sedan through the shed window. She wiped her hands on the rag. She walked out into the yard. Dale Brunner got out of the sedan. He was in a wool coat that he had not in 3 weeks needed and had not that morning thought to leave in the office. He looked at the barn. He looked at Merritt. He held his hands at his sides. He said, "Miss Halverson." She said, "Mr. Brunner." He said, "I want to walk the pens." She said, "You may." He walked past her. He went into the barn. She followed him at a distance of about 8 feet. She did not speak. She let him take his time. He walked to the first receiving pen. He stopped. He looked at the animals. He walked to the second pen. He stopped. He looked. He walked to the third. He stopped. He walked to the fourth. He walked to the fifth. By the time he reached the fifth pen, he had stopped counting animals and had started counting ear tags. He reached over the top rail of the fifth pen. He took the ear of a heifer between his fingers. He turned the tag toward him. He read the number, tag 47812. He read it again. He walked to the sixth pen. He reached in. He read the next tag, tag 47825. He walked to the seventh. He read the next tag, tag 47829. He walked to the eighth. He read 47843, then 47858, then 47861, then 47866. Every tag he lifted on every heifer he examined and every pen he stopped at was a Vanderweld tag. Every number he read was a number that had at some point in the previous 20 months been on a call list that Doris had pulled at 7 in the morning and had brought to his own desk for signature. Dale Brunner stood in the 5th through 8th pens of a Wisconsin barn on a Thursday morning in the third week of March of 2007, and he understood in the specific slow way that a 58-year-old operations manager who has been at a company for 34 years understands a thing exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at Vanderweld's next barn. I was looking at it standing in the pens of a girl he had in October of 2005 offered a disposal contract to as a personal courtesy. He walked back out to the yard. Merritt was waiting. She had not moved. He said, "Quiet, Miss Halverson." She said, "Mr. Brunner." He said, "How many are bred?" She said, 60. He said, "How many are due between April and June?" She said, 58. He said, "How many are at a springing gestation now?" She said, 31 this week, all 60 by April 15th. He said, "You have a full veterinary certification?" "Yes, sir." "You have your records?" "Yes, sir, all of them." He looked at her. He said, "Miss Halverson, I need to go back and speak to my company. May I come back later this week?" She said, "Mr. Brunner, you may come back later this week." He said, "I would like to bring Mr. Vanderweld." She said, "Yes, sir, you may bring Mr. Vanderweld." She said it the way a woman says a thing she has been waiting for 18 months to say. Dale Brunner drove back down the lane. He drove 8 miles east on County Road P. He walked into the corner office at 11:08 in the morning. He said, "Sir." Preston Vanderweld III said, "Tell me." Dale said, "It's 60 head, all bred, all due between April and June, all hours from the call line, all tagged, all records available, all local. Nearest match in Minnesota costs 180 more per head transport not included and would take 9 weeks." Preston Vanderweld III leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. He said, "Quiet, Dale." Dale said, "Yes, sir." Preston said, "Set the meeting for Friday, 9 in the morning. Her kitchen table. I will drive myself." Dale said, "Yes, sir." Preston Vanderweld III drove himself up the Halverson Lane on a Friday morning in the third week of March of 2007 in a black Cadillac CTS that had that morning been washed at a car wash in Emery. He got out of the car. He looked at the barn. He looked at the yard. He walked to the porch. Merritt was at the door. She said, "Mr. Vanderweld." He said, "Miss Halverson." She said, "Come in." He came in. At the kitchen table, Preston Vanderweld III sat in the chair that had once been Eric Halverson's. He did not know that. Merritt did. He said, "Miss Halverson, my operations manager tells me you have 60 bred heifers of Vanderweld origin ready for placement between April and June, priced competitively against the outside market. I am authorized to offer you $1,800 per head cash on delivery staged pickup across an 8-week window. 60 head at $1,800 is $108,000. That would clear your April note at First Farmers with $61,000 to spare. It is an excellent number. It is above the auction rate for equivalent stock, and it puts a period respectfully on our business." Merritt did not speak for a moment. Then she reached into her jacket and took out the small blue notebook. She opened it to a page she had prepared the night before. She said, "Mr. Vanderweld, the Minnesota comparable as of last Tuesday was priced at $2,370 per head, with an additional $230 per head for transport and health certification, for a landed cost of $2,600 per head. The Iowa comparable of the same specification was priced at $2,440 per head landed. Both come with a 9-week lead time. Your new barn opens in 3." She looked up. She said, "My number is $2,300 per head. Cash on delivery. Staged pickup across an 8-week window. 60 head at $2,300 is $138,000. That clears my April note with $91,000 to spare. It undercuts your landed cost of the outside comparables by $270 per head. And it puts every one of these animals into your new barn on the opening date." Preston Vanderweld III looked at her for a long moment. He said, "2,300 is a high number, Miss Halverson." She said, "It is not, Mr. Vanderweld. It is a market number, and it is under your Minnesota landed cost by $270. If you would like, I can walk you through my supporting documentation on the Minnesota and Iowa comparables. Dr. Osberg gathered them for me last week from his contacts in both states." Preston said, "That is not necessary, Miss Halverson." He said, "I will pay 2,100. She said, 2,300, Mr. Vanderweld. He said, 2,200. That is a fair number. She said, 2,300, Mr. Vanderweld. He said, Miss Halverson. She reached into her jacket a second time. She took out a single manila folder. She set it on the kitchen table between them. She did not open it. She said, "Mr. Vanderweld, before you answer me again, I want you to know one thing about this folder." He said, "Miss Halverson." She said, "I am not going to open it in front of you. I am not going to open it in front of a reporter. I am not going to open it in front of a state prosecutor. I am not going to open it, Mr. Vanderweld, on any day that I have not, on that same day, chosen to open it. This folder contains 28 pages of internal Vanderweld correspondence price sheets and offer letters covering the period from 1989 through 2003. It documents a pattern that 7 farm families in Polk and St. Croix counties would have a personal interest in learning about if this folder ever became public. My father's name is on page 1. Yours is on pages 3, 7, 12, 16, and 22. I have been keeping this folder for 15 months. I have not shown it to anyone outside my own attorney, and I did not retain that attorney until December. She looked at him. She said, "I am not extorting you, Mr. Vanderweld. I am not going to accept $1 over my number to make this folder go away. This folder is not for sale. This folder is not part of this negotiation. This folder is in my archive, and it is going to remain in my archive, whether you and I reach a deal today or not. What I am telling you is that I am not the person you thought I was in October of 2005. I am not the person you thought I was in January of 2006. And I would like you now, before we finish this, to look at me again." Preston Vanderweld III looked at Merritt Halverson across her father's kitchen table. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Quiet, 2,300 per head." She said, 2,300, Mr. Vanderweld, 60 head, cash on delivery, staged pickup across 8 weeks. And you and I do not speak of my father again. He said, "Agreed." She said, "Get counsel on the phone. I want a 1-page purchase agreement drafted by close of business today. No general release, no non-compete, no records transfer, just the animals." He said, "Yes, ma'am." He picked up his phone. The agreement was drafted by 4 o'clock that afternoon. It was signed at Merritt Halverson's kitchen table at 4:40. Dale Brunner witnessed it. Preston Vanderweld III walked out of the house at 4:52. He walked to his black Cadillac CTS. He got in. He did not look back at the barn. He drove down the lane. The first Vanderweld transport trailer came back to the Halverson loading chute at 7:15 on a Monday morning in the first week of April of 2007. Tory Ranyard was not the driver. It was, in fact, Frank Ratzlaff. He backed the trailer up to the chute. He got out. He walked to Merritt. He did not shake her hand. He touched the brim of his cap. He said, "Miss Halverson, I'm glad it's me driving today." She said, "Mr. Ratzlaff, I know you drove my father's trailer in April of '01. I want you to know that I know." He said, "Quiet, ma'am." She said, "Thank you." He said, "I'm going to load these animals now, ma'am. I am going to load them slow. I am going to load them the way I would load them for my own daughter. And when they are on the trailer, I am going to drive them down that road at 45 miles an hour. That is the fastest I am going to drive them. That is a promise." She said, "Thank you, Mr. Ratzlaff." He loaded 15 head that morning. He loaded them one at a time. He read every tag as it went up the ramp, and Merritt read every tag on her clipboard, and both tags matched, and Merritt signed the manifest, and Frank Ratzlaff signed the manifest, and Frank Ratzlaff drove 8 miles east on County Road P at 45 miles an hour, and he delivered 15 bred springing Wisconsin-raised pasteurized milk-fed heifers to the newly opened east side of the Vanderweld heifer barn at 8:41. The second trailer came the following Monday. The third trailer came the Monday after that. The fourth and final trailer came in the first week of May. On the 10th of April of 2007, 5 days before the balloon deadline, Merritt Halverson walked into the Clayton branch of First Farmers Bank with a certified check for $47,000 and a second certified check for the accrued interest at 7.75%. And Odette Halmstad, who was 59 years old and who had, in the fall of '98, signed off on Eric Halverson's original refinance and had never quite gotten over it, took the 2 checks in her hand and counted the amounts. She stamped the note, paid in full. She turned the stamp page around. She slid it across the counter to Merritt. She did not speak. She could not. She simply nodded once and pressed the heel of her hand briefly against her mouth and turned back to her computer terminal. And Merritt picked up the paid note and folded it into an envelope and walked out of the bank into the April sun on Main Street of Clayton, Wisconsin at 11:08 in the morning. She stood on the sidewalk for a full minute. Then she walked across the street to the diner. Ilse Ranyard was behind the counter. Merritt slid the envelope halfway open across the counter so Ilse could see the paid stamp. Ilse Ranyard, who was 42 years old and who had 25 years earlier as a young waitress just out of high school, poured coffee for Eric Halverson at this same counter. Every Saturday morning looked at the stamp and looked at Merritt and did not say anything and did not say anything and finally quiet said, "Honey." Merritt said, "Ilse." Ilse said, "Your daddy is watching." Merritt said, "I know he is." Sigrid Halverson came back to the ranch on the last Sunday of April. She stayed 3 days. On the last morning, she stood at the kitchen window looking at the barn. She said, "It's holding Merritt." Merritt said, "It's holding Mama." Sigrid said, "You did what your father could not do." Merritt said, "Mama. He wrote it down. I read what he wrote. That is all I did." Sigrid Halverson looked at her daughter a long moment. She said, "That is not all you did, honey." She said, "But I know why you need to say it that way." The story does not entirely end there. Preston Vanderweld III did not lose his job. Preston Vanderweld III continued for another 4 years to run Vanderweld Dairy from the corner office on the third floor. In the summer of 2011, in the middle of a state-level review of dairy consolidation practices in western Wisconsin, a folder of internal Vanderweld correspondence price sheets and offer letters covering the period from 1989 through 2003 arrived by mail in the office of a reporter at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, addressed in a hand that was very much like a woman's careful print. The reporter published the first of 6 articles in the second week of August of that year. The last of the 6 articles ran on a Sunday in December. Preston Vanderweld III took an unplanned retirement 3 weeks after the final article ran. He moved to Naples, Florida in the spring of 2012. He did not come back to Wisconsin. Dale Brunner retired from Vanderweld Dairy at the age of 62 in the spring of 2009. He and his wife bought a small house on the edge of Clayton 4 miles west of the Halverson driveway. He was from 2009 forward a regular at Ilse Ranyard's diner counter, and he was at that counter gentle with Merritt Halverson on the 2 or 3 mornings a year they overlapped there. Neither of them ever mentioned Vanderweld to the other. Roscoe Maloche got sober in the spring of 2008. He moved to a small rented house in Emery. He got a job at a feed mill. He testified in 2011 to the State Review Board on the record about a memo dated the last week of September of 2005. His testimony was cited in the third of the 6 Journal-Sentinel articles. Tori Ranyard and Ilse Ranyard did not move. Dr. Ansel Osberg died in the winter of 2013 at the age of 75 in his own bed in the small farmhouse on Bass Lake Road, where he had lived alone for 40 years. He left in his will a small envelope for Merritt Halverson. Inside the envelope was a slip of paper on which he had written in his own careful hand one line. It said, "You saw what your father saw." That was the work. And on a Sunday afternoon in the middle of July of 2013, in a kitchen on 80 acres in western Wisconsin, a 31-year-old woman named Merritt Halverson sat at her father's table with 2 notebooks open in front of her. One was small and blue and softened at the corners from 7 years of pocket carry. The other was small and leather-bound, dark brown cracked along the spine, and its last dated entry from Eric Halverson's hand read November 14, 1998. And beside that last dated entry in a hand that was very like his, Merritt had written that morning in fresh blue ink one line. Continued from here. M. Halverson, July 14, 2013. She closed both notebooks. She set them side by side on the table. On top of the closed leather notebook, she placed a small yellow ear tag. The tag was stamped 47823. It was the tag she had cut off the neck of a small bull-necked black and white heifer on the morning of the day Frank Ratzloff had loaded that same heifer 6 years earlier as a springing 3-year-old onto a Vanderweld transport trailer bound for the east side of the newly opened heifer barn. She had kept the tag. She kept every tag. Outside on County Road P, a Vanderweld tanker turned off the state road and started up the gravel lane. Tory Ranyard was driving. He was 38 years old that summer, still on the same road, still with the same seat cushion on the driver's side. Sigrid Halverson came out of the pantry with a fresh pot of coffee. She set the pot on the counter. She looked out the kitchen window at the tanker coming up the drive. She said quiet, "He is coming." Merritt said, "Yes, Mama, he is coming." Sigrid said, "It is Thursday." Merritt said, "It is Thursday." Sigrid Halverson looked at her daughter across her father's kitchen. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. She poured a cup of coffee for Merritt. She poured a cup of coffee for herself. She set the cups on the table beside the two notebooks and the yellow ear tag. She sat down. Outside, Tory Ranyard's tanker pulled up beside the stainless steel stock tank. He climbed down. He raised his hand toward the kitchen window in a small country salute. Merritt raised her hand back. She did not get up right away. She sat at her father's table for one more minute with her mother across from her, and the two notebooks between them, and the tag on top of the leather cover, and the coffee steaming, and the light in the yard, the color of a first July morning after a bad winter. And she thought a thing she did not say out loud, because it did not need to be said out loud. She thought they threw it out. She thought I caught it. She thought, and now they buy it back on my terms every Thursday at 45 miles an hour for as long as I choose to sell it. She set the coffee down. She stood up. She walked out to the yard in her father's caramel canvas jacket, in her red and cream flannel, and her faded blue jeans and her boots. And she walked to the tank and she took a sample dipper off its hook and she said, "Morning, Tory." Tory Ranyard said, "Morning, Miss Halverson." He climbed up to the belly valve. He turned